Berlin in 1930 was a thriving, modern metropolis. Fast forward to 1945, and it's literally absolute smoldering ruin. So as political scientists, the question we have to ask isn't just what happened. We need to know how. How does the bureaucratic anatomy of a constitutional republic collapse so completely? Today, we're going to conduct a clinical autopsy of this institutional failure. And we're not looking at this through an emotional lens. Instead, we're examining the cold structural mechanics of exactly how absolute power is seized, legally codified, and ruthlessly executed. To do that, we'll walk through this timeline of collapse. 1. The 1929 economic catalyst. 2. The illusion of control. 3. Dismantling democracy by decree. 4. Facades and fatal expansions. 5. The architecture of genocide. And finally, 6. Geopolitical collapse and ruin. Let's dive into part 1. The 1929 economic catalyst. The collapse that fueled the rise. Picture the archival footage for a second. You've got endless bread lines winding down cobblestone streets, padlocked factory gates, a society in complete freefall. We're talking about 6 million unemployed citizens. In this climate of total economic destabilization, right after the 1929 crash, the fragile norms of the Weimar Republic just shattered. When you have an environment of such profound systemic desperation, a radical's anger suddenly stops sounding like fringe extremism. To a desperate public, it actually starts feeling like a definitive solution to institutional paralysis. And this political vacuum fueled a massive populist surge. I mean, look at the numbers. From a fringe 2.6% of the parliamentary vote in 1928, radical factions weaponized this economic despair. They innovated with modern campaign logistics, like literally running cross-country airplane rallies to capture 37% of the electorate by 1932. They campaigned on this fiercely structured promise to restore order, and they leveraged mass communication to fundamentally destabilize the centrist coalition. It was a textbook, fast-paced political takeover.
Which brings us to Section 2. The illusion of control, a fatal miscalculation.
January 30th, 1933, the old conservative guard, led by President Hindenburg, engineers a coalition and legally appoints a radical as chancellor. Now, their assumption was a classic elite miscalculation. They essentially thought, we can control him, we'll use him for his populist base, and then just throw him away. But the reality, that single appointment triggered the most rapid, terrifying consolidation of unchecked executive power in modern political history.
Section 3. Dismantling democracy by decree, the bureaucratic coup.
Because you see, democracy didn't end with a violent revolution in the streets. It ended with a legal signature. When the Reichstag burned in February 1933, the regime immediately drafted the Reichstag Fire Decree. Under the guise of national security, civil liberties were legally suspended. Freedom of the press, freedom of expression, the right to public assembly, they were all bureaucratically erased, practically overnight, and the systematic purge of political enemies began.
This whole sequence was an absolute masterclass in weaponized legislation. The Enabling Act legally bypassed Parliament entirely, which granted the Chancellor dictatorial powers. Rival parties? Outlawed. Collective bargaining was neutralized by dismantling labor unions, bringing the entire workforce under state control. And Dacho was opened specifically to efficiently warehouse the political opposition. Within just a few months, a constitutional republic was bureaucratically dismantled from the inside out. It was a perfectly executed structural takeover.
Moving to Section 4, Facades and Fatal Expansions, the Mask of Stability. If you watch archival reels from the 1936 Berlin Olympics, they project this meticulously crafted domestic facade of unity, strength, and national resurgence. It looks entirely stable. Yet, beneath that mask, the Nuremberg laws had already been enacted. They were bureaucratically stripping Jewish citizens of their fundamental rights and their citizenship. This systemic legal exclusion laid the structural framework for the violent, state-sanctioned explosions of Kristallnacht. And this pre-war domestic policy was mirrored by international appeasement that fueled geopolitical overreach. As Austria was annexed and Czechoslovakia occupied, the deliberate inaction of Western powers structurally emboldened the regime. The UK and France remained inactive. This massive failure of international diplomatic structures gave the dictator absolute confidence to push even further. And that diplomatic collapse culminated on September 1st, 1939, when the invasion of Poland completely shattered the global order, kicking off World War II. Section 5. The Architecture of Genocide, Industrial Murder. At this point, we have to examine a chilling structural question. How exactly does absolute domestic political control evolve into industrial genocide?
The answer lies in the total conversion of the state apparatus itself. Legal clerks, railway logisticians, state architects, corporate manufacturers, they were all repurposed for extermination. Following conferences that strictly codified the policy, this was no longer just state-sanctioned hatred. It became a highly organized, structural policy of industrial murder. The bureaucracy operated at a terrifying efficiency, systematically claiming the lives of 6 million Jews, alongside millions of Roma, Slavs, disabled individuals, and political prisoners across camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka.
Section 6. Geopolitical collapse and ruin, the fall of the Reich. The regime's early geopolitical successes, like the rapid 6-week capitulation of France, bred a fatal strategic arrogance. Opening a massive Eastern Front against the Soviet Union in 1941, deciding to just kick the door in, was a suicidal imperial overreach. Those initial blitzkrieg tactics completely dissolved into a logistical nightmare. The state's military apparatus found itself fighting a two-front war, with entire armies frozen, starving, and ultimately destroyed in the brutal ruins of Stalingrad. This fundamentally shifted the balance of global power. From there, the structural collapse was absolute. By June 1944, a massive second front opened with the Allies landing at Normandy. By April 1945, Soviet artillery was literally dismantling the streets of Berlin, block by block. The central command structure completely disintegrated, culminating on April 30th, 1945, with the dictator's suicide in a claustrophobic bunker 50 feet below, while the capital burned into ash above him. So that so-called 1,000-year Reich, it lasted precisely 12 years, 3 months, and 10 days. The state apparatus was entirely annihilated, leaving behind a continent in absolute ruins and the unrecognizable fragments of an architect who had engineered a total global catastrophe. This immediate geopolitical vacuum completely reshaped global governance. Key surviving leaders faced the Nuremberg trials, which laid an unprecedented foundation for modern international human rights law. Germany itself was partitioned into East and West, becoming the geographical fault line for the start of the Cold War. Concurrently, the United Nations was established specifically to prevent the catastrophic institutional failures of the 1930s from ever repeating. So, what is the ultimate autopsy report of this republic? It reveals a terrifying truth for those of us who study power. The greatest threat to democratic structures is rarely a sudden violent overthrow. No. Evil can and did rise legally through the careful, bureaucratic erosion of institutions entirely accompanied by the applause of a desperate public. As political scientists analyzing these power structures, it leaves us with one incredibly critical question. In the legal, bureaucratic erosion of this democracy, at what precise moment did the point of no return actually occur? And perhaps more importantly, would we even recognize that structural failure if it happened today?